Martin Avalar never came back. His vehicle was found in Death Valley, parked at the mouth of a canyon, hood cold, keys gone. 3 days later, a search team located his canvas pack in the shade of a creosote bush. Inside was a leather-bound field journal, pages warped by heat, entries still legible. The unresolved detail was the pouch, a small cloth pouch tied shut with twine. 3 smooth river stones inside. No river within 50 miles. No note in the journal explaining them. Avalar was never located. The journal was archived in Riverside. The stones were stored with it. They are still there. In the summer of 1957, the Panamint Range sat under temperatures that exceeded 120 degrees for 11 consecutive days. This is not unusual for Death Valley. What was unusual was the timing. The heat arrived 3 weeks earlier than expected, and it arrived without warning. The region spans more than 3 million acres of alkali flats, salt pans, and cracked earth. It holds the record for the hottest temperature ever reliably recorded on Earth, 134 degrees Fahrenheit, measured in July of 1913. To the west, the Panamint Mountains rise sharply from the valley floor. To the east, the Funeral Mountains form a second wall. Between them lies a basin that drops to 282 feet below sea level. There are no towns in the Central Valley, no gas stations. No reliable water sources for distances that can exceed 30 miles. The nearest ranger station in 1957 was a small outpost near Furnace Creek, staffed intermittently during the summer months. Radio contact was inconsistent. Road access was limited to a handful of dirt routes that washed out during flash floods. It was not a place people wandered into by accident. In late June of that year, a contract surveyor named Martin Avalar was hired by the Bureau of Land Management to map a section of terrain along the western edge of the valley. The work was routine. He was expected to return within 4 days. He carried standard equipment, a canvas pack, water in military surplus canteens, a transit for measuring elevation, and a leather-bound field journal, the kind issued to government surveyors at the time. Avalar had worked in the Mojave for 6 years. He knew the terrain. He knew the risks. On July 2nd, his vehicle was found parked near the mouth of a canyon, approximately 9 miles south of his intended route. The hood was cool. The keys were missing. A search team was dispatched 3 days later. They found his pack on July 7th, lying in the shade of a creosote bush near a dry wash. The canteens were empty. His transit was missing. And beside the pack, held down by a flat stone, was the journal. The pages were brittle, warped by heat. Some of the ink had faded, but most of the entries were still legible. What follows is a transcription of the first 2 entries from that journal. The handwriting in both is steady. The tone is professional. There is no indication at this point that anything was wrong. Entry 1. June 29th, 1957. Arrived at coordinates 36.3 degam north, 117.1 degam west at approximately 0800 hours. Terrain matches the topographic survey from 1952. Elevation holding steady near 400 feet above sea level. Visibility is excellent, no cloud cover. Temperature at arrival was 91 degrees. By noon it had climbed to 107. I began the first transect along the ridgeline just north of the wash. The ground is stable, mostly decomposed granite with sparse vegetation. Creosote, brittle bush, some scattered burrow bush in the lower elevations. Water consumption is higher than expected. I've gone through 1 full canteen by mid-afternoon. We'll need to ration more carefully tomorrow. Set camp at 1800 hours near a rock formation that provides partial shade in the early morning. No wind. The air is still. I heard coyotes in the distance after sunset. They sounded farther south than usual, perhaps 2 or 3 miles out. No other wildlife observed. Will resume survey work at first light. Entry 2, June 30th. Woke before dawn. The temperature was already in the low 80s. Completed the second transect by 1100 hours. The elevation data aligns with previous records. No anomalies. No significant erosion patterns. During the midday break, I noticed something unusual near the base of the ridge. There were tracks in the sand. At first I assumed they were from a bighorn sheep. The stride length was consistent, and the depth suggested an animal of similar weight. But the shape was wrong. The prints were elongated, narrow at the heel, wider at the front. Almost human in proportion, but not quite. The toes, if that's what they were spaced too far apart. I followed them for approximately 50 yards before they disappeared into a section of hardpan where no prints would register. They were heading east toward the valley floor. I've worked in this region long enough to recognize most of the common wildlife tracks. These didn't match anything I'm familiar with. It's possible they were distorted by wind or erosion. The sand here shifts constantly, and it's easy for prints to warp as the surface dries. I took no photographs. My focus is the survey work, and I'm already behind schedule. By mid-afternoon, the heat became difficult to manage. I've started rationing water more strictly. 2 canteens remain, but I'll need to refill at the cache point tomorrow if I'm going to complete the western transects. The coyotes were quiet last night. Tonight, they're quiet again. I don't know why I'm noting that. It just feels worth writing down. Work resumes at dawn. The journal continues beyond this point. There are additional entries. The tone begins to shift, but those will come later. For now, what matters is this. Martin Avalar was a trained professional. He knew how to navigate the desert. He knew how to track wildlife. He knew the difference between a distorted print and something that didn't fit. And on June 30th, 1957, he found something in the sand that made him stop, look twice, and choose to write it down. Even though he convinced himself it didn't matter, the search team found his journal 1 week later. They never found him. The Bureau of Land Management archived the journal in 1958. It was cataloged, sealed, and stored in a records facility in Riverside, California. For decades, it remained there, untouched, unreferenced. It wasn't until 1992 that a researcher reviewing old survey documents came across the file. She noticed the unusual circumstances surrounding its recovery. She requested a full copy of the transcription. What she found was a document that began as a standard field report and ended as something else entirely. The entries that followed June 30th do not describe survey work. They describe confusion, disorientation, heat exhaustion, most likely. But they also describe something that Avalar could not explain, something he saw, or thought he saw. And in the final entry, written in handwriting that had become erratic and slanted, he stopped trying to explain it at all. This is the account as it was recorded. What follows is not speculation. It is not embellishment. It is a transcript of what Martin Avalar wrote in the days before his disappearance. The rest of the journal will be presented in full. But first, there is context that needs to be established, context that Avalar himself would not have known. Because in the summer of 1957, he was not the first person to report strange tracks in that region. And the silence of the coyotes. That had been noted before as well. The third entry was written 2 days later. By then, Avalar had moved deeper into the survey grid. His notes indicate he reached the cache point as planned and refilled his canteens. The weather had not improved. The temperature on July 1st exceeded 115 degrees by mid-morning. His handwriting in this entry is still legible, but the tone has changed. Entry 3. July 1st. I did not sleep well last night. The heat makes it difficult, but that's not what kept me awake. I kept hearing movement outside the tent, small sounds, scraping, something brushing against the canvas near the base. At first I thought it was wind, but the air was completely still. I turned on the flashlight twice. Both times, there was nothing there, just the open desert and the rocks. But the third time I heard it, I didn't turn on the light. I just waited, and I heard it move away. Not quickly, not like an animal startled by noise. It moved slowly, deliberately. The sound of something stepping carefully across loose gravel. I told myself it was a kit fox or a jackrabbit, something small and nocturnal. There's no shortage of wildlife out here, even in the summer, but I've camped in the Mojave dozens of times. I know what a fox sounds like when it moves. I know what a rabbit sounds like when it bolts. This was neither. In the morning, I checked the perimeter of the camp. There were no tracks. The sand around the tent was smooth, undisturbed. I don't know how that's possible. The ground is soft enough to register prints from anything larger than a rodent. If something had been circling the tent, there should have been evidence. But there was nothing. I resumed the survey work at 0700 hours. The third transect took longer than expected. The terrain became unstable near the eastern slope, and I had to recalculate twice. By noon, I was low on water again. I made the decision to cut the day short and return to the cache point. I'll refill tomorrow and finish the remaining transects by the 3rd. On the way back, I passed the area where I'd seen the tracks 2 days ago. They were still there. That shouldn't be possible. The wind in this region erases prints within hours, sometimes less. But these were still visible, still clear, and there were more of them now. They formed a rough line heading east, just as before, but this time they veered north after about 30 yards, and then they stopped, not at hardpan, not at rock. They stopped in the middle of open sand, as if whatever made them had simply lifted off the ground. I'm writing this from camp. It's just after sunset. The coyotes are still quiet. I haven't heard them in 3 nights. I don't know what that means. Maybe nothing. Maybe they've moved to another part of the valley. Maybe the heat has driven them into higher elevations. But it feels wrong. The desert is never this silent. This was the last entry written in a steady hand. The entries that follow become shorter, more fragmented. But that will come later. In the years since the journal was recovered, several researchers have attempted to explain what Martin Avalar experienced during those 4 days in Death Valley. The most common explanation is heat exhaustion. Temperatures exceeding 110 degrees can cause disorientation, auditory hallucinations, and impaired judgment. Avalar was rationing water. He was working long hours in direct sunlight. His body was under severe stress. It's possible that by the night of July 1st, he was already experiencing early symptoms of heat stroke. Auditory hallucinations are well documented in cases of extreme dehydration. The brain, deprived of adequate fluid and oxygen, begins to misinterpret sensory input. Small sounds become amplified. Silence becomes oppressive. The scratching he described could have been the tent fabric shifting in micro gusts of wind too faint for him to feel. The movement he heard could have been his own pulse, distorted and externalized. There is precedent for this. The tracks present a different problem. If Avalar was experiencing visual distortions, he may have misidentified prints left by native wildlife. Bighorn sheep, mule deer, and coyotes all inhabit the region. Their tracks, especially when distorted by wind or erosion, can appear unusual. The fact that he described the prints as persistent over multiple days suggests he may have been returning to the same location repeatedly, convincing himself that the prints had not changed, when in fact they had. This is a known cognitive bias. Once the mind has identified a pattern, it continues to see that pattern even when the evidence shifts. The stopping point he described, where the tracks ended in open sand, could have been a result of surface hardening. Certain areas of desert sand become temporarily compressed by temperature fluctuations, forming a crust that does not register prints. This would explain the abrupt termination. The silence of the coyotes is harder to dismiss. Coyotes are highly adaptable. They do not abandon territory without cause, but they are also sensitive to environmental stressors. In the summer of 1957, Death Valley was experiencing an unusual heat wave. It's possible that local wildlife had already begun migrating to higher elevations or deeper canyon systems where water was more accessible. Avalar would not have known this. He would have interpreted the absence as anomalous, when in fact it was a predictable response to extreme conditions. His growing fixation on the silence may have been another symptom of cognitive decline. Isolated individuals under stress often become hyper-aware of environmental details that would otherwise go unnoticed. The mind searches for meaning in patterns. When no meaning is available, it creates one. These explanations are reasonable. They are supported by medical literature and field research. They account for most of what Avalar described, but not all of it. There is one detail that does not fit. When the search team recovered Avalar's pack on July 7th, they documented its contents in full. The report is still on file. Inside the pack, they found 2 empty canteens, a compass, a folding knife, a box of matches, and several sheets of graph paper used for survey notes. They also found a single item that was not standard issue, a small cloth pouch approximately 4 inches square, tied shut with a length of twine. Inside the pouch were 3 stones. They were smooth, rounded. River stones, most likely, though there are no active rivers within 50 miles of where the pack was found. Each stone had been placed carefully inside the pouch. They were not loose. They were not rattling. They had been arranged. The search team noted this in their report, but they did not consider it significant. Surveyors often collect samples, rocks, minerals, soil. It's part of the work. But Avalar was not a geologist. His contract did not include sample collection. And the stones themselves were unremarkable. They were not minerals. They were not fossils. They were river stones, smooth, rounded stones that had no place in the desert. There is no entry in the journal that mentions collecting them. There is no explanation for why they were in his pack, and there is no indication anywhere in the survey notes or the journal entries that Avalar ever deviated from his planned route to visit a location where such stones might be found. The nearest drainage where river stones of that size and smoothness could occur naturally is more than 12 miles from the coordinates listed in his final entry. He would have had to walk there, collect them, and return, on foot, in heat exceeding 115 degrees with limited water. It doesn't make sense. The stones were cataloged and stored with the rest of his equipment. They remain in the Bureau of Land Management archive to this day. No one has requested to examine them. No one has asked why they were there. The journal ends on July 2nd. The final entry is short. The handwriting is uneven, but that will be covered in the next section. For now, what remains is this: a surveyor's pack, found in the shade of a creosote bush, a journal held down by a flat stone, and 3 smooth river stones, tied in a cloth pouch, with no explanation for how they came to be there. The search for Martin Avalar continued for 2 weeks. They found no trace of him. His vehicle was eventually towed. His personal effects were returned to his family. The case was closed in September of 1957, listed as a presumed fatality due to environmental exposure. The journal was filed. The stones were stored. And for 35 years, no one thought to ask what had happened in those final days. No one thought to wonder why a man who knew the desert would walk 12 miles out of his way to collect 3 stones he never mentioned, or why he would write, in his final coherent entry, that the desert had become too silent. The journal sits in a filing cabinet in Riverside, California. The stones sit beside it in a small cardboard box, labeled and dated. They have not moved in 68 years, and the desert, where Martin Avalar disappeared, remains as it was, silent, still, waiting.